Welcome to today's lecturette on exploring children then and now and looking at Aboriginal perspectives post-colonialism. Before commencing this lecturette, I'd like to really acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we meet today, and I pay my respects to the elders, past, present and emerging, for their ongoing contributions to the fabric of the Australian society. I would also like to acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be with us today as we spend a brief time together discussing the significant influences and historical milestones that have traced Indigenous histories since colonisation. As we move through this discussion, I would encourage you to reflect on the ways in which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families have been positioned in our communities since colonisation, and to reflect on the power relationships that have dominated this part of our history. And I would also like to acknowledge that this discussion is very brief in nature and highlights very complex issues that deserve a much fuller discussion than we can do here today. And also to recognise that it does not cover the rich history of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples for the centuries before white colonisation. The historical perspectives of our country's First Peoples is complex, but as Grace Burns and Menzies point out in your set text, it is a story of overwhelming resilience and survival. Like the Euro-Western historical perspectives that I've shared with you in a previous lecturette, the lived experiences of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been heavily influenced by the ways in which they've been positioned and the embedded power relationships that have existed between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities and successive Australian governments. Their lived experience has also been heavily impacted by the perceptions of Anglo-Australian society. It often surprises people when they begin to take a closer look at the historical milestones around citizenship and human rights for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, that many of the taken-for-granted civil rights were not available for these people for many decades after their white counterparts. For example, citizenship for Australian Aboriginals and Torres Strait Islanders was not a reality until 1967, some 170 years after Australia was colonised. Successive government policies of protectionism, separation and assimilation have fragmented the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture and language and have had a pervasive and persistent negative impact on children, families and communities. You can see on the screen some of the important milestones that I've flagged. The displacement from 1788 as a result of tension between landowners and Aboriginals, and displacement onto missions started occurring from that point in time. And it took until 1949 for Aboriginals to be able to vote, and even then only under some conditions. Those who'd served in the military could vote, but only in some states. And it wasn't until 1967 that a national referendum was held and voted overwhelmingly to include Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders into the population census and to recognise all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders as Australian citizens and to hold citizenship rights such as the right to vote. While it might be really hard to conceive of, prior to this referendum, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were regulated under the Flora and Fauna Act of Australia in much the same way as our native animals and our native vegetation. And it took until 1983 to hold full citizenship rights, where voting was deemed compulsory. I'd like us to consider the quote you can see on the screen from your set text. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries that have created negative outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families, the approach by state governments, in collaboration with missionaries, was to separate Aboriginal children from their families at an early age, remove them to institutions for basic education plus religious and vocational training, and then to send them to work as domestics, farmhands or labourers as soon as they reached their teens. The result has been a long history of the removal of Aboriginal children from their families. This process has used both overt legislation, such as deeming all Aboriginal children from birth at risk and under the protection of the state, regardless of family and parenting history, and later through the leveraging of welfare policy wording and interpretations to reach the same outcome, the removal of Aboriginal children from their families. The national inquiry conducted by the Human Rights and Equal Opportunities Commission in the 90s made the statement that not one Indigenous family escaped the effects of forcible removal, and that for many families, children were removed over multiple generations. The impact of these practices of colonisation through to current day policies of forcible removal of children, or the stolen generations, has had profound intergenerational impacts on child development, family dislocation, and cultural and community cohesiveness. It has perpetuated a cycle of disadvantage and suboptimal outcomes for many Aboriginal children. At the beginning of this lecturette, I mentioned that your text calls out that the story of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history is one of courage and survival, and nothing highlights that more than how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families have coped with the stolen generations over many decades. I'd also like us to consider the impact of these sorts of practices on education for young children of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander descent. As we consider the educational policies that have impacted on Indigenous children and families, there are three main periods that I want to briefly talk about, and that's the mission period, the protection period, and the assimilation period. The mission period from about the early 1800s, 1830, excluded Aboriginal children from public schooling. Children in this area were educated exclusively on missions by churches and charities, and the focus of this education was in the main to teach Christianity and to help Indigenous children conform to white society, rules and expectations. By the 1880s, we see a move in public policy towards protectionist policies, and that really meant that Aboriginal children were allowed to attend public schooling, although most of them remained in mission schools. But they attended public schooling at the discretion of principals. And if they did enrol in public schooling, they were actually in Aboriginal segregated classes. And the principals had the exclusive right to exclude children on the basis that they were, if they arrived at school and were deemed unclean, unclad or well-dressed, or discourteous under the legislation of the day. It's interesting to know that principals retained this discretionary right to exclude Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from schools until 1972. As we move then into 1937 and onwards, we move away from protectionist policies and we move towards assimilation. Here, children were encouraged to be enrolled in public schooling, but could be excluded if there was objections from the Anglo-Australian families or children. It was also during this area that many Indigenous children from rural and remote communities were sent away from families to boarding schools, where their assimilation could be more carefully controlled. This was another form of child removal from Aboriginal families, and the overarching purpose of assimilation was to eradicate Aboriginality from children in order that they could fit in better with white Australia. And it wasn't until the late 90s that there was significant policy change that saw a shift towards the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures that could be seen in educational policies. At this point in time, we start to see teachers were being provided with professional development, and there's been a growing focus in policy documents around funding to support inclusive practices for both Aboriginal children and families as they engage with the education system. In most recent decades, Aboriginal culture has been added to the curriculum and the learning frameworks for all children to gain an appreciation of Aboriginal culture and Torres Strait Islander culture and the heritage that represents. And since 2012, this focus has been an embedded feature in the early years learning framework through the pre-formal schooling sector. We've come a long way, but it also means that we have to recognise there is still a long way to go. In our most recent decades, there's been a greater effort in public policy to redress the human rights, discrimination and social justice issues that have been part of the historical and lived experience for Indigenous Australians. These have included policies such as anti-discrimination legislation, prosecuting and winning land rights for Indigenous Australians over traditional lands and country, funding for policy initiatives to continuously focus on elevating vulnerability and disadvantage through closing the gap initiatives. The Rudd's government in 2008's apology and the Sorry Day was a bold and contentious move, one that was applauded by many Australians and Aboriginal people in particular. However, it was contested by many. This, like so much of our Indigenous history post-colonisation, is complex, and we are far from the end of the journey. But the growing movement around reconciliation is a way forward for both Anglo and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians to create a shared future. As a professional intending to work with children, families and communities, it is important that you reflect on what input you will have in help shaping and contributing to this shared future.